Hey guys, Jared here and welcome to the Brisket for Beginners mini course. We are going to start with this full pack of brisket. We're going to prep it, get it ready for the smoker, and then we're going to smoke this thing. This is essentially a shortened version of my full brisket mastery class. So the idea is to sort of teach some of the techniques to actually get your brisket, your first one, ready to go, but then obviously for the expanded version of the course that's part of the brisket mastery course. So we have our full pack of brisket. We need to do a few things to get this thing ready to go. We put a lot of emphasis on what we did when we chose this brisket to make sure we got the right one. We looked for some good shape, some good size. We made sure it was nice and aerodynamic, and we talk about that in a lot more detail in the brisket mastery class. But what we're going to do is trim this up and get this ready to go. So the first things that we need to focus on, if we can see it here, we have two main things when it comes to our trim. We have this sort of silver skin stuff, which is going to kind of firm up and get just not very nice to eat when it's cooked. And then we also have these big pockets of fat on here. We've got this fat here on the lean part of the brisket. We're going to leave a lot of this on, but this real thick fat over here in the fatty part of the brisket, we're going to take a lot of this off. So let's get started with that now. So we're going to start by trimming off these larger pockets of fat. This is the fat that's not going to render down through the cook. So see, that's all just thick fat. We don't want that. So all of this real thick stuff can come off, and we're kind of just going to feel it out. See, again, all fat. The worst part about cooking brisket is that you are going to trim off some of the stuff you paid for, but honestly, by saving it, we wouldn't actually be saving anything because it's not going to cook. It's actually probably just going to ruin more of the brisket, so it's worth doing. So we've got these thick pockets of fat here. Take more of that off on the side. So the brisket itself is from the front of the animal. It's kind of this part of the cow here. And it's something that has to be cooked low and slow. Otherwise it's not going to be tender enough to eat. It's also broken into two parts. We have the fatty part of the brisket here. We have the lean part of the brisket here. Now you could cut these and serve them separately or cook them separately. But the ultimate kind of brisket is when we cook them both together, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So just working on some of these big parts of the fat. So using your fingers, we want to find the parts that are hard, because that's telling us that we've got big, thick fat pockets in there that are too thick to render out. Just going to run the point of our knife in there. We still want to maintain our shape as much as we can, but we're also trying to take out that brisket fat that's not going to render. Basically, any of the fat that's too thick has just got to go. But we want to make sure that we're not taking too much, because that fat is going to bring a lot of our flavor. Then we're going to make sure we're taking off this silver skin stuff here. You can see there it's kind of stringy. It's the silvery kind of color. We want to take that off. I'm just going to run the point of our knife underneath and then just gently work it out. Just like that. And this is one where we're trying to conserve as much of it as we can, because this is still good brisket. We just don't want the silver skin. Okay, so we have trimmed the bottom side of our brisket. We've obviously still got some fat here, which is good. We want the fat. Fat makes flavor, but we don't want it to be so thick that it's not going to render out as the brisket cooks. We've also trimmed off our silver skin, because if that silver skin stays there after the cooking process, it kind of gets rubbery and chewy and just not very nice. Ultimately, you could leave it there if you wanted to. I mean, we're not doing competition brisket here, but it is a much nicer experience with just a little bit of a trim. So now we are going to do the much harder side, which is the top side of the brisket. Now when we're trimming up this, similar things, We obviously want to make sure that we are trimming it. I'm going to turn it around a little bit. Oh. So when you get a brisket, it's the front side of the cow. It needs to be cooked low and slow in order for it to be at all tender. You'll notice oftentimes that there's sort of like some strange coloration on this side. Sometimes it's kind of gray, it almost looks cooked, and that's essentially because it is. So when the cow is being processed, they run it through sort of like a steam bath at one point, and this is the part of the cow that's exposed to that, which is why you can kind of see that discoloration there. It's not a big problem. We're going to cut off a lot of this because that's mostly fat. There's a big pocket of fat right there on top. This is the decal here. This is where your burnt ends would traditionally have come from. We're going to take off some of this as well, but we definitely want to make sure we save it because it's awesome to eat. We're going to trim off most of the fat up here, but leave as much of this fat down here as possible because this is the lean side of the brisket. We just want to make sure that it's consistent across the whole thing. And we definitely want to trim up to make this brisket a lot more aerodynamic, and we want to kind of keep some consistency in the thickness. And that's something I talk in a lot more detail about in the actual brisket mastery course, but let's have a crack at it. We're going to take off this decal. Basically, it's just this big part that you can see is just separated on the top. It's not going to cook well, so we're just going to take it off. It's a really nice marbled piece of meat, so like I'll always cook it up. It goes great for slow cooking, but when attached to the brisket, it's just not a lot of help. And we're going to tackle this really thick piece of fat here. Again, we're going to feel it out because we want to find the thick parts. We don't want to get rid of our meat here, we just want to get rid of the fat. But there is plenty of it here. So we're going to be quite aggressive with this part of the trim. So as you can see, we've cut a nice big wedge, and that is just fat. But make sure you're feeling it out because as you run down the brisket, that is going to start to turn into meat, and we want to keep the meat. Just goes layer by layer, slow as you want. You can always take off more, but once it's gone, it's gone. This here, on the other side of this, we trimmed off quite a decent hunk of fat, and so it's left us with this quite thin area here, most of which is fat, so we're actually going to take some of that off as well. So what I'm going to do is, because we're leaving most of this fat on here, I'm just kind of decide where that's going to end. So for me, usually we've taken off a lot of the decal, but we've got some of the thicker part here. For me, I kind of run it down to about where that decal ends. I run a kind of imaginary line through here, and everything below that is going to stay. Or at least a 1/4 inch of it's going to stay. On a brisket, we have two different kinds of fat. We have this real thick, hard fat, but we also have this really sort of soft, rubbery fat. And we essentially want to make sure that we're not keeping any of that rubbery fat up on here either. So we're just getting rid of this rubbery fat here. It's not going to be good. So we want to get rid of all of that. This is the lean part of our brisket, so we're going to take some of this down. But you can see that the fat here is actually really thick. Now what we want to do is keep this a consistent, probably 1/4 inch across the brisket. So we're just going to trim this down. Trying to find where the fat is. And make sure, by feeling it out, see now this is a lot softer because we've thinned it out quite significantly. So we're just pressing the fat so that we can figure out where it feels even and where it's harder, so we can know where we need to trim it. Now the last thing we're going to want to do is we need to see here we've got a lot more thickness on this side than we do on this side. So we're going to trim this up to help keep it kind of more aerodynamic. Just because this part of the brisket, and there's lots of fat in there, there's barely any meat, it's just not going to end up good. It's better if we just trim it off now than try to save it and we'll lose it anyway. So we're just going to take off this thick part. Again, we're going to feel it out. We're going to be pretty aggressive with this one. So we're going to call that wastage, unfortunately. And then we're just going to even it up on this side. We want to make it fairly aerodynamic. So it's a lot more even. That smoke's going to be able to pass around it nice and smoothly. That's a nice consistent thickness across the lean part of this brisket. So our brisket is now pretty much ready to go in the smoker. All we're going to do next is we're going to season it up with some Grim Reaper rub. Then we're going to slap it on to this smoker. So we'll come back to that soon. Alright, so now we've got our brisket nice and aerodynamic. The only thing we have left to do before we put it on the smoker is season this up. We're going to use our charcoal based rub. It's going to use my Grim Reaper rub for this one. Makes a real nice thick bark. And this, if I can bring it all in without dropping it, is our wastage. This is all fat and bits of the brisket we've trimmed off. Now it's rough because we essentially paid for all these pieces of brisket, but even though some of them have some meat in them, like this here, it's just not going to work for the brisket itself. We could try to keep it on and it would essentially have more yield when we put it on the smoker, but that meat isn't going to cook well. It's going to overcook, or it's going to keep this really gluggy and not cooked nice. So it's actually better if we just cut it off now, and we're actually going to end up with more yield at the end of it because of that. All right, so it's a little bit later on, it's midnight. It's time to chuck this thing on the smoker, getting ready for tomorrow dinner. So we're going to start off, we're going to season this before throwing it on the smoker. And I'm going to be using my Grim Reaper rub today. It's a charcoal based rub. It's heavy in black pepper, kosher salt, and some other really good spices. We're going to give this whole thing a good coating, and we're going to throw it on the smoker. Okay, so we're going to use our Grim Reaper rub. It's got a nice charcoal base, and we're just going to season this whole brisket. We're going to focus on making sure that we're getting a pretty even coating across the whole thing. So we're going to use the shaker. We're going to hold it fairly high, and we're just going to keep going over it until we feel like we've got a good even coverage across the whole brisket. Now, sometimes if there are pockets where there's a space between the meat or the fat, you want to be careful not to get too much of the rub stuck in there, because it often won't cook properly, and we want to avoid any parts that are uncooked or undercooked, or the rub is still kind of raw when it comes time to eat it. We don't want to rub it in, we're just going to pat it down, make sure that it's got a nice attachment. Now you could use a binder. Yellow mustard is pretty common. Sometimes I do that, sometimes I don't. For this one, we're just going to go straight no binder, because the Grim Reaper rub is a real good focus on building bark. We're not going to need that binder. I'm going to hit it on both sides, make sure it's got nice even coverage. Okay, so we have our brisket. I'm going to place this in the cooker, but what we want to do is kind of bunch it up, get it kind of close together. What that's going to do is going to help it, as it cooks, to kind of push upwards rather than to lay out. We've got our thicker end towards the hotter side of the smoker. We're going to sit it here unwrapped at 225, and we're going to leave it here for probably 3 hours until we come in, give it a quick spritz, check the temperature, and eventually we're going to wrap it up. That's it. Okay, so we have our brisket here. We've been smoking for most of the night, and now we are going to take a look at it. So we turned it midway through the night, just because we wanted to make sure that it was as far away from the heat source as possible. So now that it's shrunk down, we can do that. And we've got our water pan there in the corner. So every 2.5 hours, we went ahead and spritzed this one, and we're just going to go ahead and check this for temperature. So I'm going to chuck that into the thick part here. Cool. Yeah. Okay. So we see about 160, 170. That's good. So it's time for us to boat this. So we have here our boat. The boat is this foil where the brisket is currently sitting in. The idea is that this is going to sit there, the liquid is going to sit in the bottom, which is perfect, but then the top of our brisket is still going to have full access to all of that smoke and heat. Our bark is going to form, it's going to stay there, it's going to get nice and thick and full, but on the bottom it's going to help us stay nice and juicy. Now the other thing about this as well, as you can see on top, probably the most noticeable part is all of these white little splotches. This is beef tallow. Fat is flavor, and so what we've done is we've added in more of that flavor. It's going to help us keep it nice and juicy, it's going to add a whole bunch of flavor. In a few minutes that's all going to melt down, it's going to sit on the bottom, and this brisket is going to be sitting in this beef tallow for the next couple of hours. As we go through, you can see that we're poking this thing here with our thermometer. Now obviously the thermometer is important to know the internal temperature of the brisket, of course, but we're also using it here really for a textural check. We really want those probes to be able to slide in real easily. When people say that something, is like butter, that's what they're referring to. We're going to take this brisket off, we're going to let it rest for about an hour. And then when we remove that foil from it, you can see this incredible bark there. It's really nicely black and thick and firm, and that's our rub and the smoke and the juices from the brisket all kind of melding together along with that beef tallow. And then we're going to go ahead and slice our brisket. Now slicing a brisket is honestly one of the most important parts of the whole process, and it's really important that you do it correctly, because it's actually a big part of the tenderness of the brisket itself. So we're going to start by splitting the brisket in half, and I talk about this a lot in the full brisket mastery class, but for now we're just slicing up the flat of the brisket here. We're slicing it against the grain, and we're going at about a pencil thick, and that's because that's the ideal thickness for a brisket slice. When we're looking at this actual slice itself, we can see obviously along the top and along the sides, we've got that really, really great bark there. It's really thick, really dark. We can also see that we've got a really nice ring of smoke around the outside. It's not too thick, and that's totally fine. Smoke ring is really just an aesthetics thing. But then you can see throughout the middle as well, it's really juicy, really tender. It's going to pull apart with not too much effort, but obviously is staying solid there as well. You can see on my gloves all of those juices, all of that flavor that's sitting there, and that's been able to be retained inside the meat of this brisket because we let that rest. And again, I talk about that in a lot more detail in the full brisket mastery class. This is obviously just the flat of the brisket, and so we're going to make sure that we take a look at the point of the brisket as well, which is the part where we would get our burnt ends from if we're making those, or we're going to get some really incredible slices from the point of the brisket as well. That's my favorite part of the brisket. But you can see, our good brisket should have some really great meat on it. We should have some of that fat there, especially on the flat along the top, because it doesn't have very much intermuscular fat. And obviously all of those other elements are really good bark, really juicy meat, and be really nice and tender. And if you can get a smoke ring in there, that's even better. But again, it is totally just aesthetics. So when we've got our brisket point, again, because we've split the brisket initially, we're now going to start by cutting through the center from front to back, because we're going against the grain. When we're slicing up the brisket point, we do want it to be a little bit thicker, and that's just the nature of the meat. I'd say it's about, it's the size of a bigger pencil rather than a regular sized pencil. When we bring that slice out, in here you can see an even better smoke ring on this brisket, which is nice. Again, we have that really thick bark. Probably the biggest difference that we're going to see with the brisket point versus the brisket flat is some more of that fat running through the center of that slice. And that's just based on the way that the biology of the brisket works. That fat, hopefully we trim down enough on the edges that it's not too thick and it had a chance to really render down like this has. It's still going to be there to some degree, but the bulk of that has rendered down, which is perfect. If we are looking to make burnt ends, we're going to cut them similar to the slices. The main difference obviously going to be the thickness of these here. We're looking for those to be about an inch thick, and then we're going to slice it into the burnt ends. Now, If you pick up the brisket course, you can also pick up the burnt ends module as well. Obviously the burnt ends are based a lot to do with the way that you cook a brisket, but how you sauce it, how you cook it, the recipes and things like that for the burnt ends are part of the burnt ends course as well. If you really are looking to improve your brisket skills, if you're looking to cook a brisket for the first time, I hope this video was helpful, but definitely make sure you check out the brisket masterclass. It goes into way more depth. It's the things that I've learned from doing it myself. It's from other people who have been cooking briskets for a really long time, have put a lot of time and effort, experience, and experimenting into. Things that I have learned that I really want to share with people like yourself, just to help you sort of get there a little bit faster. You know, I always say that good barbecue comes from bad barbecue, and I really do believe that, but that barbecue doesn't have to necessarily be yours. You know, you can always let other people make those mistakes for you. Cut down some of that time for you to get to your incredible brisket yourself at home. So go ahead and check that out, or just enjoy what this video is here. If you want to go ahead and check me out on Instagram, it's _Howlowcanyouslow. Go ahead and join us on Facebook at Barbecue for Beginners Facebook group. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much. Hope you enjoyed the video. Good luck smoking that brisket. Smoke on.